Good evening, everyone. My name is Jure Gantar, and I'm the Acting Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Dalhousie University. I have a very pleasant duty tonight to welcome you all to the inaugural Stanfield conversation. The challenges that democratic ideas and practices face every day, both locally and globally, are central to our faculty's mission. As these challenges evolve, the Stanfield Conversations is ideally positioned to become an important venue for addressing them in a very public, but also very safe, respectful, and intellectually stimulating manner. In our faculty, democracy is discussed in one way or another in most programs, but few spend as much time on it as our political science department. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you my colleague, the Lester B. Pearson Chair of International Development Studies, the former chair of the Political Science Department, and the co-chair of the Organization Committee for this year's Stanfield Conversation, Dr. David Black, who, together with several other members of our faculty and staff, was instrumental in bringing about the event and will be your host for the evening. So please welcome Dr. David Black.
Thanks very much, Yuri, and it's wonderful to see real people in a real auditorium. So in the immediate aftermath or the immediate wake of two exercises in electoral democracy in the province and the country just over the past 2 months, in the shadow of new evidence of shocking forms of exclusion and injustice in Canadian democracy experienced particularly by Indigenous and Black Canadians, as we observe some of the most inspiring cases of democratic gains globally, like those in South Africa or Brazil, struggle to preserve these hard-won achievements, as we bear witness to the struggles of ordinary citizens globally to gain or protect basic democratic rights and freedoms, often at great personal risk, and as we watch the resurgence of powerful and to many compelling alternatives to democratic forms of political life internationally, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first annual Robert L. Stanfield Conversation concerning the conditions, challenges, prospects, and possibilities facing the idea and practices of democracy. So as a political scientist, I have a personal and professional stake in the importance of discussions about democracy. But I also think we can all agree that there has rarely been a more important time to re-examine and rethink it. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726, nearly 3 centuries ago. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Dalhousie University sits on the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people, and we are all on a journey to understand how we can make that reality and commitment more vital in all of our lives. And with this in mind, it's my great privilege to welcome to the stage Catherine Martin, Dalhousie's first Director of Indigenous Community Engagement and a Mi'kmaq traditional knowledge keeper, to offer a welcome to Mi'kmaq territory. Catherine.
Medawaloktiok, nin gadalanan maltaya, weli giskuk. No response. Hello, everybody. It's a beautiful day. My name's Gudlin Multi, or Catherine Martin, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the unceded territory of my ancestors, of me and my family, and I want to thank those ancestors who thought of us in every decision they ever made. They thought 7 years before, 7 generations and 7 generations ahead before every decision that concerned all things. A true form of democracy. I often welcome people, as our ancestors have for 14,000 years, with a welcome to our land, to share in it as we always have, and to welcome you with a chant that Sarah Denny of Eskasoni, a well-known elder who took a lot of her whole life to bring back and revive within our hearts the songs and the dances and the culture and traditions that Canadian law, government, and Indian Act outlawed for us for 250 years. So Sarah was not just a traditional knowledge keeper, but someone who had been able to keep our traditions that went back thousands and thousands of years. She taught me this chant. It's a chant using the heartbeat of Mother Earth, the heartbeat of our mother, and it is the language that everybody can understand if they go back to the original language of their mother, the heartbeat, and we know that that is the truth. The language, the first language of our mother is the truth. So when we speak from our hearts, we all go back to our original language. She often asked us to sing this chant to whenever nations gather together. We sing it in celebration of birth, in death, for marriages, and so I'm offering this chant to you. And I'm glad that we're talking about democracy and making sure that we treat all beings, animals, fish, trees, people, the same. As I sing this, I ask us all to consider the lives of those little children, those beautiful souls who went missing and never came home, and are now working with us to try to find all of the children in this country that never came home. Guano de, guano de, guano de, guano danahi, guanalia, guano danahi, guanalia, guano danahi, guanalia, guano de, guanalia, guano de, guanalia, guano da, ego, igane, ego, igana, guanalia, guano danahi, danalia, guano danahi, Kwanalia, kwanoda, hey, no, daho. And now I just want to welcome everybody back to the beautiful art center that I have known for so long. In fact, I graduated with my degree in theater arts, and this was my home for 3 years. And the very first day of school in Robert Merritt's history class, I met my husband, and we're still together since that time. So enjoy, and it's nice to be here. Walaliok, Emsitnokama.
Thanks, Catherine, for that very generous welcome, and also for your initial reflections on Indigenous approaches to democracy, which is, I hope, something that we will continue to carry forward in the conversations in the years to come. I'm now pleased to invite the president of Dalhousie University, Deep Saini, who arrived at Dal just in time for the global pandemic and has had relatively few opportunities to greet the community in person. And so I would like to welcome him to offer his own words of welcome to us tonight. Deep, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Black, and thank you, Kathy, for that very touching and melodious welcome to the country. On behalf of Dalhousie University, thank you all for joining us this evening at our first annual Stanfield Conversations Talking Democracy event. This is really exciting. This is the inaugural Stanfield Conversation. I'm so pleased that we are finally able to hold this event in person with our speakers on stage today and an audience here with us. We also have many more joining us virtually, whether you are here or on campus, joining us from home or elsewhere. Welcome. I would also like to express my gratitude to Dalhousie's College of Sustainability, who have included this event in their weekly lecture series. Thank you to the students from the school who are gathered for the lecture this evening and joining us virtually from the McCain building just next door on that side of this building. We are honored to be hosting this evening's Stanfield Conversation at Robert Stanfield's alma mater, Dalhousie University. Dalhousie is truly well placed to lead this discussion. We have a history of producing respected political leaders from our alumni ranks, as well as a history of fostering the study and practice of democratic politics in all its varied forms. We are also pleased to be working with the CBC, who are sponsoring this event, and over the course of the past week, they have been highlighting the issues this conversation raises. The overarching focus of the Stanfield Conversation series is on the question, where is democracy today? This is a critically important topic for discussion, and we should be all concerned about this subject. Democracy means something different to everyone. So let me share some of my own personal reflections about democracy from my own experience, and I'll be very brief. I was born in the post-colonial India. Just 4 years after India made its tryst with democracy with its first Made in India Constitution. Growing up in a country, that is India, that is often referred to as the largest democracy on earth, I have been an informal student of democracy for most of my life. For me, based on these experiences, one requirement that has emerged as the fundamental essential for all the healthy democracies is accountability. When accountability begins to erode, the vacuum is almost always filled, and it's filled increasingly over time by the forces whose interests are served by even less accountability. And then you are on a slippery slope. The vicious circle this sets off inevitably leads to the demolition of nearly every other aspect of democracy over time, and then eventually democracy simply ends up becoming a sham exercise in periodic voting with actually no particular meaningful consequence to show for it. It is this background that has incubated my own personal enormous interest and excitement for this particular series and my personal support for the launch of this series. And I'm looking forward to seeing this series grow under my watch. I look forward to hearing today from Dr. Taylor and Dr. Chambers about the state of democracy, how and why democracy is on the edge, and what we can do about it in our own country and globally. Thank you all again for joining us today, and please enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deep, for those reflections on both the global reach and also the global vulnerability of democratic political life. So it's my distinct pleasure now to invite to the stage the Right Honourable Joe Clark, former Prime Minister of Canada, former Minister of External Affairs, former Minister of Constitutional Affairs, among many other roles in public life. These roles currently include serving as the co-chair of the Advisory Council for the Stanfield Conversations, and he's going to briefly reflect on some contextual reflections on the origins and significance of the Stanfield Conversations. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, David. Ladies and gentlemen, I do have the honor, with the Honourable Anne McClellan, to co-chair this advisory council, which has shown a great deal of imagination and determination. Two different concerns converged to inspire the Stanfield Conversation that we are inaugurating tonight. The first is the challenges to democratic governance. I can take this off, what relief. Challenges to democratic governance are growing at an alarming rate in communities around the world. The second is that we need models from either actual experience or creative thinking about the standards of leadership and engagement required to address these challenges. The governance challenges are well known, and they are evident every day, virtually everywhere in the world. The qualities of governance and leadership of the late Robert Stanfield are not so well known beyond this province and this country which he served. And no example will fit everywhere. But what does fit is the standard he set and maintained through an accomplished career, combining foresight and innovation, a respect for genuine differences, and a determination to address and reconcile as many of those differences as possible. In increasingly complex times, no leader, indeed no citizen, knows their country, knows their community as well as we need to. The common challenge is to make our community more than it had been. And that is where the Stanfield Standard can apply most effectively. This idea was born in Nova Scotia, as Robert Stanfield was, but its evolution has reached well beyond these shores. We have benefited from donors determined to look ahead, an advisory committee of diverse talents and perspectives, and a university committed to helping shape the future as constructively as it has the past. And we could not have a better beginning than with our panelists, Charles Taylor and Simone Chambers. I am delighted that the Advisory Council's work has led to this evening and look forward to the discussions that will ensue, not only tonight, but I hope for time to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, for those sanguine remarks about the origins and the foundations of the idea behind this series. So it's now my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce our special guests and speakers for this evening's discussion of democracy on edge. Simone Chambers is Chair and Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and was previously Director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Toronto. Simone is a political philosopher and a leading international specialist in democracy studies. She is widely published on topics such as Canadian constitutional politics, referendums, the digital public sphere, including fake news, rhetoric, and civility. Her new book, The State of Contemporary Democratic Theory, is a critical survey of the ways political philosophy is addressing the democratic crises of our times. And she also has a familial relationship to our second speaker, Professor Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is known to many of you as an internationally celebrated Canadian philosopher and Professor Emeritus at McGill University. Professor Taylor's work famously bridges the gap between philosophical theory and political action. Remarkably, in addition to being one of the world's leading political philosophers, he ran for federal office 4 times for the NDP in the province of Quebec. His writings have been translated to more than 20 languages and have covered a wide range of subjects, including multiculturalism, modernity, humanity, morality, artificial intelligence, language, social behavior, and indeed Canadian politics. This work has earned him numerous prizes, including the prestigious Kyoto Prize, the Templeton Prize, and others that I won't list in the interest of time. But in addition to the widespread in which he's held, or the widespread esteem in which he's held among political philosophers and philosophers more broadly, he has also been called many things, including one of a handful of the most important thinkers of our era. So it's a great privilege to have Professor Taylor with us here tonight. And finally, I'd like to introduce Vassy Kapelos, known to many of you as the host of CBC's Power and Politics, who will be our moderator for this evening's conversation. Prior to working at CBC, Vassy was Ottawa Bureau Chief and host of the West Block on Global News. And while covering federal politics, she's interviewed everyone from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. She's covered and anchored multiple elections, and I know was antsy about missing this one because she's recently added a new member of her family. Vassy has also reported on stories and events all over the world, from places like Rio de Janeiro, Iraq, South Korea, and Japan, and reported on breaking news across Canada. She's also, and I would suggest perhaps most importantly, an alum of Dalhousie's Department of Political Science, where she received a master's degree probably 15 years ago, and is one of those graduates who reminds those of us who teach at this university that our most important achievements are often not the scholarly work that we do, but the graduates that we have some small hand in launching on their way. So it's a great privilege and pleasure to welcome to the stage Vassy Kapelos, along with Charles Taylor and Simone Chambers.
That's always a really important and also challenging question. What is democracy?
Democracy is I think
Wow, that's a difficult one.
Democracy is a system that provides for contested values and practices over time.
I would say democracy is not a given.
Democracy is representation.
Democracy is essential.
Democracy in its most basic sense might be understood as the rule of the people. That raises two important problems. Who are the people, and what does it mean to rule?
I think democracy is in crisis. Way too often it gets contained into the idea of electoral politics. Real democracy is what happens in the street, you know? Everything that has been significant in the last 10 years and policy changes have come about through social movements. Change comes from the people, always and only. And that's the meaning of democracy.
Democracy has evolved, but both in a bad and good way.
Democracy hasn't been tried and tested enough for us to make the argument that it's the best form of a political system.
Current forms of democracy haven't been giving people what they need.
Does the rule of the majority, is it capable of adequately including everyone's perspective? I think within like a settler colonial state, it inherently reinforces oppressive systems.
I wonder though if in that there isn't something that our ability to see that it's damaged, our ability to see that there are systemic problems within the Canadian democracy also isn't a signal of something that's healthy.
We talk about democracy being on the edge in the sense that we finally reached kind of a fundamental point where people realize that we really need to start making changes if we want to see things get better.
Canada can go two ways. We can make some meaningful changes at this turning point, or we can just have more of the same.
Democracy is a complicated thing because people are complicated things. Everyone has different value sets. Everyone has different morals. But at the end of the day, it's in all of that complexity and all of that cacophony where we find solutions.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's a real thrill to be your moderator this evening and an honor to be back here at Dalhousie. I don't think I've ever been so excited to be in a room with people because it's been about 2 years. As Professor Black mentioned, this is my alma mater. I'm a proud graduate of Dalhousie. I certainly wouldn't have the job I do without the education I received here. As he also mentioned, I've spent the past 3 months focused on when to change diapers. So when I tell you I'm thrilled to hear from our speakers tonight and very excited to learn from them, trust me, I mean it. I'll tell you a bit about the structure of how this evening will unfold. First, we are going to hear some opening thoughts from both Professor Chambers and Professor Taylor. Then I'll have the opportunity to ask them some questions. And my questions will focus a bit on if democracy is in crisis, why? If so, how did we get here? How do we get out of here? Is it possible to fix democracy in crisis? And then finally, I'm anxious to talk a little bit about the Canadian example, especially in light of what took place this week, which I was very upset to miss, but I did watch like everyone else in this room, I'm sure. And then we will take questions for a good chunk of time from you in the audience, as well as everyone who's watching on the live stream. You all have an opportunity to submit your questions, and we'll hopefully get to as many of them as we can. So, Professor Chambers, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Vashti. Am I turned on? Yes, I'm turned on. So I really have to begin by thanking the organizers for the invitation to join this conversation. It's an honor. And it's an especial honor to be part of a conversation named after Robert Stanfield. Mr. Stanfield was a great Nova Scotian, he was a great Canadian, and he was a great Democrat, but he was also a great friend of my father's, Egan Chambers. And Egan Chambers was also a great Canadian and a great Democrat. He wasn't a Nova Scotian, but of course we can't all be perfect. So, but he was, above all, a great admirer of Mr. Stanfield. And he was a progressive conservative running for federal office in Quebec in the late 60s and early 70s. So as you can imagine, he had many political disappointments. But it's really his biggest disappointment was that Mr. Stanfield was never prime minister. He really thought of Mr. Stanfield as not just a great politician, but a great person, and he thought that Mr. Stanfield would have been transformative for Canada if he had been Prime Minister. And he often articulated that regret. So that kind of feeds into my really honor to be part of this conversation. And I wanted to start just with commenting on this wonderful montage we had by the students who were talking about what is democracy. And one of the things that it illustrates, of course, is that there are many different definitions. It's very hard to define. We disagree about it. And some people think that this is a problem. Some people think, oh, if we could only all agree, on a definition of democracy, we maybe can get it right. But I think it's great that we disagree, and I think part of this conversation is about talking about our disagreements, and looking at all the different kinds of ways that we define democracy. And it would be worrisome, actually, if we did all, I think, agree, because disagreement, John Stuart Mill was famous for saying that what you don't want is dead dogma, and if you don't argue about things, they become dead dogma. So arguing and disagreeing about what is democracy is, I think, a very healthy direction to take. In my own research, so I never begin with the definition of democracy, but I do begin with what I call the question of democracy. And the way I articulate that question, it goes something like this, that the question of democracy is how do people who are fundamentally equal, they have an equal status, an equal stake, an equal right to rule, how do they organize, regulate, and coordinate their life together as equals, right? So nobody starts off as the boss. And that's a kind of a question that has a lot of different types of answers. It's a different, if you're 10 people on a desert island, if you're 20 people starting up a cooperative, or if you are 38 million people in a complex modern society. So the answer about how equals can really coordinate their lives together, as I say, has many different kinds of answers, and it would be surprising if one definition could really capture the complexities of the answer. And we see a great variety of answers from a sort of minimalist view, well, democracy just is, free and fair elections, to a maximal view that thinks of democracy, it's not just the equal right to vote. We have to have a society in which equality is more broadly instantiated. But what's really interesting is right now, at the beginning of the 21st century, although there's no agreement about what democracy is, there does seem to be a kind of consensus that it's in trouble. So from people who have the minimalist to the maximalist view of democracy, there's this consensus that democracy is in crisis, it's in trouble, it's on the edge. And it's really quite surprising how the variety of different kinds of articulations of that. So what I wanted to do just very briefly now is to go through sort of what people are talking about, because they sometimes are talking about different things when we talk about democratic crisis. So I'm not really going to talk about what I think is the crisis. I'm going to talk about the way people in the press, journalists, ordinary citizens, but also political scientists, what they're referring to. What is the kind of evidence out there that things are bad? And I think maybe Chuck will talk about the deeper kind of causes of this, and I'm going to be talking about the evidence we have out there that things aren't really quite right. And I want to talk about 4 sources or 4 dimensions of the crisis. So the first one has to do with institutions, and it's usually referred to as democratic backsliding. So in political science, for example, we have all these indices of measures of democratic institutions. The kind of core institutions, of course, are votes, equal voting rights, the equal opportunity to run for office, and basic freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of association. And so what we are seeing at the beginning of the 21st century across all sorts of democracies, we're seeing an erosion of some of these institutions. In the case of voting, of course, we see voting levels going down, but even more worrisome, we see that it's actually becoming harder to vote in many places as opposed to easier to vote, and that is a form of backsliding. We see in the case of the equal opportunity to run for office, most democracies have actually some formal equal opportunity, that is, they don't exclude women, or groups of people, but it turns out that across all liberal democracies, there is a very skewed candidacy selection process. So really people who are in power, who have money, really have a huge advantage in running for office, and this seems to be a problem and an erosion of our institutions. And then finally, you do see in some democracies really serious erosion of freedom of the press, freedom of association, and free speech. And sometimes this is done through the weakening of the courts, that is the weakening of institutions that protect free speech. Sometimes it's seen as a direct assault, but sometimes it's seen in rhetoric, that is the rhetoric which villainizes critical journalism, which talks about opposition voices as being anti-democratic or against the people. And so we see a very serious erosion in many democracies of those freedoms. So that's one perspective, the kind of outside perspective looking at the institutions. The second perspective is what is called in political science the subjective one, and that really has to do with attitudes. That is citizens' attitudes and beliefs and trusts. And so what's really interesting is that the World Values Survey, which surveys people across the globe, it turns out that everybody wants democracy. It is one of the most highest ranked values in all surveys. Amartya Sen once said that it is the one thing that comes closest to a universal value across the globe. So you find everybody wants democracy, but you find more and more people are really worrying that their actual democracies cannot live up to the aspiration of democracy. So you see dropping levels of trust and confidence in the institutions, in representatives, the representative institutions. These are out of touch, they're unresponsive, and so on. You see dropping levels of trust that democracies can actually solve problems. So at the subjective level, when your citizens really don't trust the institutions and are really feeling very uncertain about democracy, this is a significant sign of weakness and decline. The fourth dimension, which is connected to the second, is referred to as output crisis. And this is the problem that democracies are unable, for various reasons, to be able to pursue the policies, have the kind of outcomes that can really address the most serious problems of the 21st century: climate change, also pandemics, equality. And here, sometimes the argument is that democracies, because they're on election cycles, these short-term cycles, really can't come up with the policies that are long-term. It's very hard to sell a policy that you say it's going to be great for people in 100 years. Not so good for you. So this endemic problem of electoral cycles seems to limit the kinds of policies. And the problem of output leads to, in a lot of different directions. One direction are people who think, you know, we really actually have to take questions out of the hands of citizens and put them into the hands of scientists, technocrats, and experts on things like climate change or pandemics, because democracy, it's too messy, it's always, you know, it's compromises and negotiations, and we really have to have the people who have the facts to be able to answer the questions. But this output problem can also lead in other directions. If you live in a slum in Rio de Janeiro, then maybe what you really want is somebody who's going to tell you that he's going to solve the crime problem. And you think democracy is, again, too messy, it's too slow, it's too full of compromises and negotiation. And what you want is a strong person who can fulfill that promise. So when people see the outcomes as being, or democracy as being unable to really fulfill those outcomes, there are all sorts of ways in which you find a moving away. And then the fourth dimension is input, and that has to do with citizen competence. So since Plato, people have been worried that citizens really aren't up to the job of running themselves, ruling themselves, that they don't have the knowledge and the intelligence. But in the beginning of the 21st century, you see a twist to that. It's not so much the claim that citizens don't have the cognitive ability. It's that we now have information pollution to such a high degree that citizens, even if they do have the fundamental competence, are unable to get the basic kinds of information they need in order to make judgments to be able to become minimally competent citizens. So we have information pollution in the form, of course, of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, propaganda, and manipulation. And this has really come to a level of a crisis level, many people think, where citizens are being relied on to make judgments, but they do not have access to the kind of fundamental facts. So those are the four dimensions that certainly in political science, and also I think in some of the popular press, are kind of used as evidence that democracy is in crisis. And I hope as we have the conversation, I think some of these crises are a bit overstated. And I just want to end with three kind of cautionary notes. The first is we should always look at things in comparison. So many of these dimensions of the pathologies of contemporary democracy, they're better or worse in different places, you know? So some places are doing okay and some places are not doing okay on different kinds of dimensions. So as I say, we should look in comparison. My second point is that we should never take, or we should not take, the United States as the index case for democracy. The United States is a very large democracy. It is the oldest democracy. I think that it is probably the democracy that is having some of the worst pathological crises of democracy, and that places like Europe, Canada, Australia do not have the same pathologies as the United States. So we shouldn't take as I say, the pathology of the United States as a universal template for democracy in crisis. And then finally, I do think that there are some exciting innovations out there to address some of these problems, some new ways of citizens to participate. There are, I do see some silver linings to be able to push back on some of these crises. So I'm going to be the voice of optimism in this conversation as we go forward. So that's my opening salvo, if you will.
Excellent. Thank you. Professor Taylor?
Yes, well, I want to introduce a note of gloom in this. I'm slightly more pessimistic. I mean, I'm trying to sum up what I think is the malaise of democracy today. It would be something of the following kind, that for a lot of people, the system is terribly opaque, in the sense that, you know, I have a problem. I'd like to be able to have a better job. I'd like to be able to give my children better education and so on. And the system isn't producing this. And how do I intervene? What are the levers, right? Now, I think if you compare today with, let's say, the period right after the Second World War, there was a party system set up, also the whole élan coming out of the war. We must have a better life than we had in the 1930s. They set up the welfare states that we live in today, but it was slightly more moth-eaten today. And they had full employment. And there was a system of parties left and right where you could, if you wanted a little bit more left, you could press that pedal, vote for those. And if you wanted to make it go slower, you would vote for the other side. At the moment, a lot of people feel, what can I do? The situation of many, many people in Western democracies today, working class people, for instance, is much worse. They don't have the kind of lifetime jobs, or if they did, their children aren't getting the kind of lifetime jobs with benefits. Their work is precarious, it's uncertain, it's part-time. In a lot of cases, the welfare state is being eaten away. The public sector is being eaten away. And one of the reasons why we don't have this kind of sense of, okay, I know what to do, I know who to vote for to rectify this, is that we've lived in a political system which has slid towards a certain set of agreed fictions that really hide the possible levers. I mean, whereas there's today a tremendous belief in what I call neoliberalism, which is this exaggerated faith in markets, that somehow markets will make everything work out, including distribution. And along with that, we've had another, in itself, a very positive development of globalization. And the combination of globalization and neoliberalism has been that the ravages of globalization in a lot of advanced countries, the loss of jobs, etc., is considered as something that almost a law of nature, because you've got to let the market do it, and if you do, then you have to make sure that people get enticed to keep their jobs in this country, so you have to lower the taxes and so on and so on. And we've got a situation in which people feel helpless to address very crucial problems for them. And this is one of the conditions which makes it possible to have the kind of ravages that we see today, which we sometimes describe with the word populism. Now, the other important factor is this, that one of the really good things about Western democracies since the Second World War has been that they've begun to tackle really terrible differences in privilege, where some people consider themselves privileged, that they come first and others come second, and the structures are such that this gets fed back to them, and they do in fact come first. Think of men coming first and getting jobs, and women maybe later on. Think of the various kinds of racial senses of superiority, as it were, racism in regard to blacks, racism in regard to East Asians. Another kind of sense of superiority, which very much in our country is people who come from eventually Europe or come here, their ancestors since Jacques Cartier, as against Aboriginals, right? And, or if you take certain European countries, the way in which they've received, England and France, a lot of people from their ex-empire, and these people are kind of seen as second zone people. And there's been a pushback against that, a real attempt to change that in many of these fields, right? The work of feminism, the Black Lives Matter, you can go on and on with that. And this has created a reaction. It's created a reaction among lots of people, including lots of working class people, including lots of people that ought to be allied with those other people in order to get their real problems solved. And it's opened the road to what we think of as populism, right-wing populism. Now, of course, I agree with Simone. The United States isn't the whole world, thank God. But Trump is a kind of good example of that, right? Because he said, you have a problem, you don't have a job, your kids aren't getting a proper, really secure jobs, I'll solve it for you, right? And who's to blame? These people from outside, they've been favored by these liberal elites and so on, and I'm going to give you a job. Of course, this was a completely useless methodology, actually, to solve those problems, but it got to be tremendously believable to lots of people. You look at the case of France. It's kind of worrying because the development came differently. Towards the end of the 20th century, there was in France a lot of openness, and a lot of people said we've got to integrate these people from North Africa and so on. And there was this great movement, touche pas à mon pote, don't touch my chum, where the chum was somebody from North Africa and so on. And then things began to switch in the other direction. You get the legislation against wearing hijabs in school, the Stasi legislation. You get this hardening of the idea that French culture is in danger from these people, and which incidentally had a spillover effect in Quebec, which was very, very negative. And you get this veering away from what could be the proper operation, the creation, if you like, of an opacity, of uncertainty where the levers are, and then the identification of totally phony levers, which involve discriminating against certain minorities or outsiders or possible immigrants. We can repeat this similar operation if you look at Germany, the movement towards a suspicion of and fear of immigrants and so on, right? I think that is the nature of the shift and why we have a mixture of generally speaking, not available levers really to solve your problem, and a slide towards a belief in these mythical levers, which involve rejecting others who should be the natural allies of members of our society. What to do about it? But I think I think we got to seriously address that. But I think let me stop here, and we'll go into that later.
I'll stop you right before you were going to solve the world's problems. Maybe I'll actually follow up on and start just where you left off, because it got me thinking about a discussion actually I was having earlier today around, even in reference to the Canadian example, right? There are a lot of people in this country who feel excluded right now from any kind of positive impact or effect of the institutions as they exist, or the politicians who have won the election or who didn't, who have power. The example is obviously much bigger and to a different degree in the United States, but how significant, from your perspective, Professor Taylor, is that level of exclusion when it comes to the effectiveness of a democracy, or how do politicians even try and address that? Or how do we?
The effect of exclusion, you mean exclusion of people?
People who feel excluded by the democracy as it exists right now.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's the reaction against any attempts to include, right, which has created a public of people that previously privileged, and these can even include workers if they're white in the United States and so on. It's a reaction against that which has been, as it were, captured by, if you like, populist demagogues. But there are two sides to this. If there had been a real solution on offer, the chances of a lot of those people going over to this mythical solution would have been less. It wouldn't have been zero, because there is this reaction, we have to face it, there is this reaction against serious attempts to do what a democracy has got to do, which is to get over these blockages of privilege and confinement in certain areas. But it's a difficult transition, and it's been made much more difficult by the fact that there weren't mechanisms, parties, programs, which really could have addressed the issue. I mean, think of, the extreme case of the states, okay, but it makes it clearer you have this inability to have a health system in the United States because it's constantly being shot down. No, okay, Europe is not that bad, but you have the austerity policies of the European Union, which produced a situation in which the terrible crisis of 2008 led to a lot of suffering which really couldn't be relieved, and led to absolutely appalling behavior towards Greece, frankly, in which they were forcing them into an absolutely impossible kind of austerity, right? So can you not understand that a lot of people get very angry at this, and they want relief, and they don't seem to be able to get it from the operation of their democratic systems as they live them, so they turn to Salvini, Geert Wilders, you name all the rose gallery of European demagogues.
Professor Chambers, I guess what I wonder then is, how do you counter that?
Well, actually, I wanted to answer your first question.
Please do.
I wanted to just say something a little about Canada and about this last election. Because if you look at the four dimensions that I spoke about, Canada does actually quite well in the first and the last. So that the institutions are actually quite strong. We have, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of the press. We have free and fair elections. It was not a great voter turnout, but that I think is maybe an exception, because the last two elections before that actually were very high voter turnouts, relatively speaking. So the institutions really appear to be strong. And also Canada doesn't really, everyone's suffering from dis and misinformation, but actually, relatively speaking, Canada does not have a lot of disinformation. The Canadian information world is not that segmented, or there are not that many echo chambers. So on those two, Canada is doing very well. But the two in the middle, you see in surveys that, and particularly in this election, there was a great deal of disappointment that really deep questions of inequality and climate change and so on weren't addressed, as opposed to strategic questions. So there is high levels of alienation of the process. The process isn't responsive, and also feelings that the government isn't really producing the kinds of outcomes. But for the most part, that leads to kind of run-of-the-mill alienation, which is bad and which leads to the weakening of democracy, but it doesn't drive a lot of people into the arms of populists. So populists did, of course, gain the popular vote, but relative to other parts in the world, it's still very strong. And well, we can get into, what the problems were for the people who did vote for the populists, but it really wasn't attached to this general malaise of that democratic governments, particularly when caught in electoral cycles, are unable to address the problems that Canadians really want them to be addressed. And that the public opinions polls show very clearly that there is this real danger of a growing lack of responsiveness or feelings of the citizens that the government isn't responsive to their concerns, and particularly the long-term concerns about addressing structural inequality, climate change, and those issues. So as I say, I think this election showed good on number 1 and number 4, but not so good on 2 and 3.
You mentioned, though, that there are some silver linings. When you think about what you just laid out, is there a fix to that then? Like if the government seemed more responsive to issues that matter to Canadians, or if they were more responsive, I should say, is it less of a hill to climb, for example, than in other countries?
So yes, so I have all sorts of innovative ideas, and you're all going to think they're crazy. But so one of the things that actually Canada is very famous for in democratic theory, I don't know if you know this, but in 2004 Canada had the first citizen assembly in BC. That it was a citizen assembly convened for electoral reform. And since then, the idea of a citizen assembly and the practice of a citizen assembly has really taken off. So they are experiments all across the world of citizens coming together. They're kind of like big juries. You select them randomly, and they come together and they deliberate. And there are a lot of pluses. First of all, there's no campaigning, there's no money, there's no parties. You just pick people out of a hat. It turns out they actually, when you give them a particular problem to solve, these are great deliberative institutions. Citizens really step up to the bat. They solve problems. They come to really good conclusions. And these institutions are being integrated more and more into different kinds of democratic situations. Ireland's using them. Scotland's using them. France used it for a citizen assembly on climate change. It turns out that citizens came forward with 140 recommendations, which were much more progressive than the Parliament. Of course, they're not beholden to industry or special interest in those kinds of... So I think there's a lot of potential for the use of this institution, not to replace parliaments, but as a supplement of citizen participation and citizen voice. Because one of the things that you find with these institutions, not only do they really come up with good output, that is good solutions, when they are part of a larger debate, citizens listen to them. So right now we're in a situation where citizens, there is really deep and growing distrust of elected representatives, because there is this perception that they're all strategically just out to, to win the next election, that they're not really responsive to the concerns. But when citizen assemblies come to conclusions and then throw them out to the public to discuss, the general public actually trusts citizens more. So for example, these are often used in referendums. So the citizen assembly is a smaller unit will come up with the question and also come up with some of the talking points, and will engage in a dialogue with the rest of the population. And they are really quite innovative and exciting democratic innovations. And okay, I knew I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for saying this, so you always do, but there is a proposal out there to reform the Canadian Senate into, and of course you should never talk about reforming the Canadian Senate, because that always gets you into a big fight. But it's out there, and I would like to come back here in 10 years and see whether or not, I would not be surprised if this doesn't really take off. As an institution that involves citizens in a different way, but is a very exciting way, and citizens in general, when they get involved in it and learn about these institutions, are really very positive about them. So this is one small innovation to get more responsiveness on the part of people in power.
You mentioned the issue of trust and trust in politicians, and maybe a declining level of it. I think the media is certainly not immune to that at all either. Professor Taylor, how important is trust to the health of a democracy?
But I think, trust is very important, but I think I want to take off from what Simone was saying, because I think there are two sides to this problem, and we need to tackle it from both sides. And I think her side is absolutely essential, because a lot of the programs that are put forward by parties, and you vote between them, and supposedly they're going to carry them through, they're very ill thought through. And people know that they're not really well thought through, and they have a lot of promises that really can't quite be carried out, and they know it themselves. And what we need, one of the things we need, is improving the quality of deliberation available in the society. And this kind of thing, particularly citizens' assemblies, are a good example, where the thing is really worked through by people who start off without any access to grind in party terms. But, somebody says, this is a good solution. Well, that's good up to here, but then you've got to consider that. And things that are properly digested become part of what's available to the public, and part of what the parties running have to, make obeisance to. And that improves the quality of the deliberation. But I think there's another side to it, which is the one I'm talking about, which is the creation of rallying alliances between different people who actually have an interest in solving these problems and are not being sirened away to phony solutions which involve just targeting minorities, right? So there's a political mobilization side, and there is a thinking out what proper deliberation side, and the two have to come together to make for a real breakthrough out of our present dilemma.
So the second side that you mentioned there, can you explain what that looks like?
The
other side that you mentioned,
yeah.
Can you explain what that looks like?
Well, that would look like a political alignment which is capable of moving a lot of the people who have common socioeconomic problems, right? And reaching across what are present divisions over these issues of identity and their stance on the whole issue of equality. In other words, if you could bring people together on realistic programs. Now, in our actual situation now, the nature and feel of these programs is, alas, perfectly clear. It's got to be global warming dealt with, and this has got to be dealt with by the development of different technologies, and this is going to require a lot of investments in various areas to produce the technologies, find a way to, recycle lithium and so on and so on. So something like the Green New Deal is the program which virtually all Western democracies have got to get behind. And this is something that you can bring people together on because it's plainly been really thought out. And this is something which is a really existential issue. So we need that kind of political mobilization, and we need the thinking out of the alternatives, and that could get us out of our present jam.
Just a quick follow-up as you were explaining that, I sort of, again, thought of the Canadian example. And there's not a whole lot of that cross-partisanship or over partisan lines where the big issues are concerned. In fact, over the past 5 weeks, those cleavages were often highlighted by each of the parties running and each of the leaders running in order to maybe create more of a choice or to the detriment of their opponents. Like it was all about what divides parties or what divides leaders. Yeah. How realistic is it, do you think, in this context that what you just described would happen?
Absolutely plain. I mean, if the re-elected Liberal government gets serious about the programs that they keep talking about global warming, there's another party, which I won't mention because I'm too close to it, but it's the NDP. Together they're a majority in Parliament, right? Talking very concretely today. These kind of programs could be launched tomorrow. And they've been talked about by the Liberal government, but there's been a hesitation, a fear, let's not go too far, and so on. So it's a cross-party, but there's enough sense of what's the good of the country and the planet in both those parties, and in other parties too, that there could be a coming together on that. Okay, there'll be still a difference in party, and 10 years from now we'll have another set of problems. Yeah, but we're talking about now, what can be done now, and it's just staring us in the face. That is what is so agonizing for an observer of Canadian politics.
So can I just jump in? So we were invited to this conversation a long time ago, and we committed, and we were, but we didn't really think we were going to be talking about democracy 3 days after an election. So I said, "You promise we won't actually have to weigh in on the election?" But you've broken the promise. Yeah. So I want to just take it a little bit up to a more general level. And so one of the things that you hear people who are worried about democracy is that they complain about partisanship. And I'm actually not so against partisanship. There's these sort of three levels. There's partisanship, and there's polarization, and then there's radicalization. So partisanship means that you have a cause. And sometimes that can be a good cause, right? A cause for justice, you want to fight for it. And actually, in the public sphere, Citizens need to see contrast and change, not is there climate change, right? So you would want parties to actually have different programs, and you can't expect consensus, and you don't want consensus. So partisanship can be a really great engine for programs and competition and good debate. Polarization is when the differences start leaving the actual substance, so you don't disagree about substance. Now you're just on teams. And so when you're polarized, the thing is, the worst thing that could happen is for the opponent to win office or to come into power. So you don't really care about what the positions are, just that you don't want them to come into power or you don't want to lose power. In the United States right now, it's very polarized, both parties. But that's still not as bad as the third level, and that is radicalization. And what radicalization is, when you take polarization, you take this idea, it would be the worst thing in the world if the opposition party came to power, and then you are willing to break the rules to ensure that they don't come to power. So that you break norms, you break rules, you're willing to lie, you're willing to violate normal norms of, say, truthfulness and these kinds of things in order to make sure that your opposition doesn't come to power. So and in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans are polarized, but it's only the Republicans that are radicalized, and not even all of them, but, unfortunately a lot of them. Where you do see a violation of those norms. I think in Canada, it's still partisan, so there are still, differences, and there are still arguments, and there are divisions, but those can be good if we're all talking about how to solve a problem, but having different views about it, as opposed to not even recognizing the problem.
Yeah, there's another thing in extreme polarization. I agree very much with the idea we've got to make it irreversible. And that is that there's a kind of amalgam of a whole lot of different issues, our team and their team, so that you get crazy things like, on our team, we don't believe in masks, right? And this gets to be a kind of loyalty test, whether on all these different issues you subscribe to the. And of course, this makes it impossible to have any kind of sensible policy on these different issues, because it's commanded by our team believe this, and we will not accept mask mandates, etc. It's so this is the death of any kind of intelligible policy making.
When you reference sort of the three different levels, first of all, if there wasn't partisanship, I probably wouldn't have a job. So I'm definitely not going to argue against that. But when you look at the other three levels, moving away from, let's say, the Canadian example, where would you, from your perspective, there be a democracy in crisis based on the sort of triaging that you mentioned?
So I think the United States actually is democracy in crisis, and the reason is because the Republican Party is radicalized. The United States has the oldest democratic constitution in the world, and that has often made people think, oh, that must be because it's a great, strong constitution. But part of the problems is that it's full of really old and very obsolete institutions. So, the filibuster, the Electoral College, the way in which the Senate is structured, lifetime Supreme Court, these are all institutions that once you have a player that's not willing to play by the rules, particularly the filibuster, they are disastrous. And the United States right now is facing a crisis of democracy in which one party is willing to violate pretty conventional norms of fair play in order to stay in power, in order to exclude the opposition from power. And that is really it's a different. It's not exactly the problem of populism, right? It's electorally driven by some of the dynamics of populism, but it is a party it is a radicalization of the polarization that is leading to the abuse of these institutions. So I'm very worried about the United States, the democracy. I'm not so worried about Canada, but I mean, we could always do better, of course, in Canada. I think actually in Europe there are populist movements that are challenging but I think the institutions are actually quite strong in Europe, democratic institutions, and they will fight off the populist push for the most part. I do.
What about you, Professor Taylor? When you think of a democracy in crisis, what comes to mind?
Well, I think I agree with Simone. Our democracy is much less in crisis than theirs. But when you get to, in this direction of, we've really identified it, this kind of polarization where they're seeking irreversibility on one hand, and there is this kind of amalgam of a whole lot of different issues behind some kind of loyalty notion. There you get a democracy in really terrible crisis. And it can only lead, you can only emerge from that in the end with what we're beginning to see, alas, in countries like Hungary and maybe Poland and Turkey, where it's replaced by something else, namely by a regime which considers itself to be the embodiment of the people and no one else. In other words, it's no longer a democracy. It's ready to tip over into a clear non-democracy.
Many of the examples you provided, and you've written on this as well, under the guise of democracy, purport to be one, right? So in many of those countries, a declaration of democracy, in essence, is just that, and really there's a rise of authoritarian power. Does that compromise the sort of global or the more societal, I guess, impression of democracy? And does that impact, therefore, its potential impact or its effectiveness elsewhere, outside of those places?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, democracy feeds on this sense when we have in certain periods, like for instance, after the fall of the wall, that yes, it's the movement of the future. Of course, you get foolish versions like Fukuyama, that the game is over, it's always going to be that, but there's a sense that it's on the march. And what we're getting now with these regimes we're talking about that are almost tipping over is quite the opposite. And then you get the voice of China saying, we told you so, that kind of system is such a mess, you need strong central control, and the sense begins to move that this is, if you want to get something done, if you want to solve your problems, don't go that direction.
And I really think that some of these regimes are giving democracy a bad name, because they actually do want to claim to be democracies, and so they're very interested in redefining democracy as it's simply the fact that they have a majoritarian mandate, but what they do is they strengthen the executive, they weaken checks and balances, they weaken things like the courts, and what they do most of all is that they squash opposition in the public sphere. They squash the press, free and fair debate, really kind of pluralistic challenges to their power. And so, and they claim, what they do is they narrow down democracy to just a majoritarian mandate, whereas a democracy without a really, really vibrant, contestatory, opposition-led and a really strong free press is not a democracy if you just have the vote. But they are very keen on trying to justify themselves as democracies, and so I think it's important that we push back and not call them illiberal democracies, because that just feeds right into the narrative. They say, yeah, there are liberal democracies and there are other kinds of democracies, and we want to be this kind of democracy. But it's not just that they're illiberal. They actually are distorting what a democracy is because they have narrowed it purely down to a majoritarian mandate.
Does that underscore, though, maybe that it is important to have a definition of democracy?
It is, yeah, so it is true. So I do sort of somewhere there have a definition, because for me the heart of democracy is this idea of a free and pluralistic debate, which feeds into the electoral system. And without that, you really don't, you have a sham democracy. I mean, just voting, the Soviets, the Supreme Soviet, they voted all the time, but nobody really thought that was a democracy. And so yes, so I would push back on their narrow definition of democracy as being inadequate, and it's an inadequate articulation of this democratic question that we are all equal. So even the minority, the people who didn't vote for the party in power, are equal citizens. And so you might be elected by a majority, but you must rule for the whole of the people. And these regimes don't do that, and they are not really interested in citizen input, and particularly critical citizens, when citizens or the minority, for example, asks questions or forms an opposition. So they really ignore the most important part, I think, of democracy. So it is true. I do challenge their definition of democracy. So.
What about, Professor Taylor, from your perspective? Like, what is inherently necessary? What is most necessary to have democracy?
But I don't think there is a single thing. That's the point. And now we see when you look at Hungary, that exactly what Simone is mentioning, that's missing. But there are lots of other ways in which democracy can go wrong. It can get into a kind of stalemate. It can have very inadequate planning. It can have a very short-sighted view about the threats that it faces in the world, like various parties that want to deny global warming. There are just so many ways it can fall apart that the list would be so long and still have possible additions if you try to say all the things we need.
Is there a hierarchy though? And I guess I'm getting at, how important is citizen participation? How important is the ability for people to debate and discuss openly what is going on?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely crucial. It's absolutely, and then they not just debate in small groups, but that the debate can spill out into the public sphere and so on. That's absolutely crucial, and that's what we're not seeing in these quasi-democracies that are ready to tip over. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Some of them are so keen to not to tip over totally that they don't go over to, let's say, the Russian model, where it's pretty well clear, Putin sends the message: if you drink the Novichok, if you really become a nuisance, they want to maintain themselves within the sphere of what looks like democracy. So they got to be elections, and they got to win the elections, and they say that's sufficient, and of course it isn't. But they realize that their whole credentials as a democracy would be lost if they really imitated Putin.
I just want to remind everybody who's watching and who's watching on this in person and on the stream that for just a few minutes, I'm just going to ask probably one final question, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. So please do send those questions in. I guess to wrap things up, Professor Chambers, I was thinking earlier today, I mean, obviously I've studied this far less than either of you, but when I was in grad school, and prior to that I lived in South America, I remember being struck by the idea that not everybody, I lived in Argentina, for example, not everybody there thought democracy was good because it hadn't produced necessarily the outcomes that they had hoped for. And in this country, we often, you'll hear people say we take it for granted because our democracy works the way it does. How important is it for people to believe democracy is good or will work for them for democracy to thrive?
Well, I guess I think there are two questions there. There's one is whether you believe in democracy, and the second is whether you believe your democracy is actually doing. As I said at the beginning, there is quite a lot of empirical evidence that most people really aspire to democracy. They want real democracy, but more and more people are thinking that their actual democracies are not living up to that. They are failing them in all sorts of ways. And sometimes they articulate that by saying, democracy can't answer questions. But what they're really saying is that this democracy isn't doing it. If it was the case that large numbers of people in Western democracies gave up on democracy in the sense that they went, so there are really two directions to go. One direction is you go for technocracy, that is you hand over more and more of questions to experts and scientists and less questions to citizens, or you go the autocratic way and you hand over more and more power to individual executives and have less and less. So that's the kind of populist autocratic way versus the sometimes called epistocracy, that is giving decisions to experts. And I don't see most citizens of Western countries ready to give up on democracy wholly for some other system. They are deeply disappointed in their actual democracies, but not in the aspiration of democracy. If they did give up on the aspiration of democracy, that would be very bad.
Professor Taylor, your thoughts on that, and then I'll turn it over to questions from the audience. Your thoughts on that, and then I'll turn it over to questions from the audience.
No, I think that we've got to see this in a wider context. Phenomena like we look at Hungary today, analogous phenomena have existed recurrently, and one of the important things is the idea of a strong man. So the evil that is perceived by people behind the strong man is that there's much too much debate, discussion, division, so that nothing can get decided. So something like Peronism in Argentina is a perfect example of that. But it allowed for recurrent elections, and eventually, you can lose them. But the idea is you've got to have get a single person there, really with a strong hand to. And that, of course, is the death of other aspects of democracy, and the one of the kind that Simone is talking about. So, this present phenomenon of quasi-democracies, in its exact form, no, we haven't had it before, but it's been a recurrent occurrence in the history of democracy. And it locks the democracy into a kind of lessened form.
Okay. So we do have a number of questions from people who are watching. I'll start with one from Dave, who is watching us on YouTube. Professor Chambers, I'll throw this one your way. What steps should democracies take to turn citizens from passive consumers to active, engaged, and responsible participants?
Oh, that's a toughie. So actually, I believe in a division of labor for citizens. All citizens don't have to be the same. I don't really have a very high bar of citizen expectation, because if you want all your citizens to be incredibly knowledgeable and to be active, and you're always going to be disappointed. We live in a busy modern society. We all have different kinds of interests, and so I'm interested in exploring what the floor is, not the ceiling. And so for me, the floor really is information. That citizens have interests and they have preferences and they articulate those in their votes, but they have to base those on judgments with solid information. And I think the biggest threat we have to democracy right now is a threat to information and access to information, just facts, facts upon which people can make their decisions and develop their judgments and their opinions and their preferences. So I think from the point of view of citizens, the most important thing is to really guarantee a certain type of education, which is an education in literacy, digital literacy. We are not putting the genie back in the bottle. We are going to be getting our information more and more in the digital ecosystem. That is a new kind of ecosystem. It has different sorts of threats. I mean, the old information ecosystem also had threats. It also had manipulators and lies and so on, but these are being delivered in new forms. And so for me right now, digital literacy is really important for citizens. I don't think we need to have everybody as an activist. Could you imagine if all citizens were activists? It would be a disaster. So that's really right now in the 21st century, my priority is digital literacy and accuracy in information, people forming their opinions.
Can I quickly follow up on that? Because we didn't really touch a lot on misinformation or disinformation, and you talked about how that's a huge threat right now to democracies. You mentioned genie out of the bottle. Is the genie too far out of the bottle for even education, for example, or digital literacy to make that big of an impact? Because I know many social media companies, for example, now they're all of a sudden interjecting and showing some signs of responsibility in this area. But we've gone through multiple elections where it did its damage.
Yes, but I agree, but we have to step back. This is all really pretty new, right? Facebook is, 17 years old, and a lot of communication experts say really the digital age is only 12 years old, and we really didn't wake up to the problems since 2016. It's only five years, right? And even since 2016 to 2021, there has been huge advances in not that the owners of these platforms have all of a sudden discovered their civic duty. But there has been growing transparency, growing push for regulation, a growing knowledge base. Every university in North America now has an institute studying digital information. We are gaining all sorts of knowledge, and I really do think that if you ask me this question in 5 years, it will look different. So social media is evil in some ways, but it's not going away. And I do think we can, to some extent, regulate it. I think the real danger are elites manipulating it, and not the platforms. The platforms aren't interested in maintaining democracy, but they're interested in making money. They're not really interested in destroying democracy. There are some elite actors who really are interested in wrecking the public sphere and using digital media to do it. And I think we have a better chance, or we have some chance of regulating the digital platforms going forward, because they have to operate within liberal democracies, and they know that. I mean, they're going to resist, and they're going to be bad players like the tobacco companies, but we're going to get them. We're going to get them under control.
They seem to be resisting a lot less lately. Doug in the audience asks Professor Taylor, what about electoral reform in Canada and getting rid of first-past-the-post results? What about electoral reform in Canada and getting rid of first-past-the-post results?
Global warming.
No, electoral reform. The question is about electoral reform.
Sorry, no, getting that. Yeah. I think that, very imperfect system here we have. I think the best kind of system is something like they have in West Germany, where you have a certain number of seats, for territorial seats, because you keep that link between the MP and the constituents. But I think we have to balance a bit more and not have this ridiculous imbalance or lack of correspondence. And that would mean that you partly add to the people who are elected territorially from people from party lists to balance it a bit more. This is going to mean that situation we seem to be coming into anyway. There will probably always be coalitions, and this will become the norm. But this wouldn't be such a terrible thing, and it would cure a source of great discontent, which I understand, that people feel, our votes just weren't reflected in our influence.
Okay. Professor Chambers Pierre, who's watching on YouTube, asks, do notions of equal rights and democracy have the same place in democratic discussions? What if you have a majority who do not support equal rights?
So that is a very interesting question. So what if you have a majority of people who use democracy to get rid of democracy? That is a problem. So, do you tolerate the intolerant? Democracy is this kind of, it's in a loop. That is, you can't have democracy without rights. And so if you, vote to get rid of the rights, then you actually have voted to get rid of the preconditions that actually justify the legitimacy of the decision to begin with. So, there's a philosophical answer to it, and then there's the practical answer. I mean, if we live in democracies, there's nothing you can do. I mean, if you really have a government that is elected to power, I mean, I can't call out the forces against it. So as a kind of pragmatic de facto, there is no way to stop a democracy from actually self-destructing in some ways. But we're not actually close to that idea. I mean, the Supreme Court of Canada, like the Supreme Court of the United States, doesn't have legions or regiments or whatever it is to call out. So there is some, idea that we have to be in a kind of virtuous circle. But I don't think we are anywhere near that kind of a situation.
That's a relief. Professor Taylor, a question for you specifically from Candace in our audience tonight. What do you think is the most urgent issue in Canadian democracy that should be addressed? Is Canadian democracy living up to the proper standard of liberal democracy?
What should be addressed? Well, I think that one of the things is this problem of electoral reform. But I think that otherwise, it's something that can't be structurally changed. It has to be changed by people's expectations being much stronger, that parties deliver, that they actually address the problems they claim to address. And that's something which requires a more, let's say, discerning and demanding electorate. I think we still have an electorate that is, in many, many cases, just backing a certain horse, and they're happy to back that horse, and they don't have the demand that these parties deliver on facing the really important questions. Or they're thinking in terms of, very often they're thinking in terms of the influence of a certain group and increasing that rather than thinking of really good outcomes for the Canadian people. I mean, the example of this, of course, is the Bloc Québécois, a typical example of that kind of operation, which is not really concerned with outcomes for the whole country, but concerned with positioning itself to increase the influence of a certain part of the country.
Can I just jump in on the question of electoral reform? So one of the best uses of citizen assemblies actually is for electoral reform. So the problem, of course, with electoral reform is that how do you expect people who won in a system to actually change the system, right?
And you have a little first-hand knowledge with that.
Yes,
in the
of
country,
course.
Yeah.
And so there is a serious problem of stakeholders being given the job to reform the system. So citizen assemblies, of course, are nonpartisan. They're not part of parties, and they're very good at problem solving one issue as opposed to having kind of a legislative agendas. And so the Citizen Assembly in BC was actually a very wonderful assembly. And the reason why, in the end, it made a proposal for electoral reform, but the threshold for the referendum was at 60%, which is very rare. You almost, even the most successful referendums in the world very rarely hit 60%, and it was 57.8%. So in a normal referendum, it would have actually passed kind of with flying colors in a way. And I do think that the path to electoral reform in Canada is through first the provinces doing it, and first beginning with citizens' assemblies to make proposals that go directly to referenda to change, and not the legislatures are never going to really do it properly.
If I remember, though, with the BC case, there was a lot of consternation around the question being asked and sort of the way in which it was all spelled out. Like there was accusations that it was confusing for people and that they didn't exactly know what they were.
It's interesting. So the system that they chose actually is being used more and more. It was something very similar was used in the New York mayor race. So more and more you see it at local elections, but more and more these preferential voting systems are being introduced, which is basically it was a preferential voting system with a lot of fancy math on how the votes get decided, but it's actually being adopted in all sorts of places. And the fact that 57.8% support in a referendum really is a very successful. And the case in Ontario, which the Citizen Assembly chose proportional representation, that was different. It didn't come close to passing, but it was proposed during an election campaign where there were a lot of other issues on the ballot, and so it kind of got lost. But I do think there's a lot of appetite for electoral reform, and I do think a citizen assembly is the route to go to choose the...
I guess I find it so interesting because it was, for some people, it was such a big issue federally when the promise was made. And then, 57%, yes, it's a big number, but it wasn't 65%. It wasn't, the bar was 60, it wasn't 65, it wasn't 70%. And so...
Have you ever heard of a referendum where 70%? I mean, it's unheard of in political science where you study it. It's unheard of.
I guess I wonder, though, is there an overwhelming, just to challenge you briefly, is there an overwhelming desire for it, as people who really advocate for it will say?
There's an overwhelming dislike for the system. As opposed, so if you look at the constitutions that have been enacted in the last 30 or 40 years, nobody chooses this system, right? You inherit this system, you don't choose it. And it's very hard, of course, to change an electoral system, but it is pretty unpopular across Canada. So there isn't any alternative system that when you look at the surveys that gets whatever 60%, but the unhappiness with first past the post is coast to coast.
Be interesting to see what people think after Monday as well on that question. Another question from YouTube, Professor Taylor. What are your thoughts on the use of the internet for voting in elections, particularly with the advent of decentralized systems like blockchain?
No, I mean, they are considerable, but you have to be able to check. This is one of the problems. I haven't really thought about the detail, but the devil is in the details there. But provided you can be certain that this is the person pushing the button there is really that person, and it's the only time they vote, and so on, there's a lot to be said for it. You don't have to have all these terrible problems of turning out in a snowstorm or in the conditions that we had last Monday, right? People were waiting hours in the streets of Toronto.
So I used to be very opposed to mail-in ballots, and I used to think, you know what, it's really important that you go to your polling station and you're there with your fellow citizens. And actually, I think lining up is great because, you know, you're there all kind of waiting in line together. But this, the pandemic has changed my mind, and I think in the American election, really a lot of people were very, very invested in the election, even though they, you know, voted by mail and not physically. So I think you can have civic activism and connection, even though you're not physically at the polling station. And I've come totally around, and I also think that electronic voting, online voting, as long as it's secure, is definitely a way to go. And citizens can be civically engaged even when they're sitting in their living room.
I will say that I think the numbers just came out a few hours before we got up here, but turnout was at first count pretty low, and it's gone up when they counted most of the mail-in ballots, as well as the ballots for people who came into a station but weren't already pre-registered, and now it's well above 61% instead of 58%. So it was below a lot of elections previous to this, and now it's actually surpassed some of those, which is kind of interesting because of things like mail-in voting. A question from Annie. Professor Taylor, how would you describe the relationship between democracy and environmental sustainability? Environmental sustainability.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the democracy has to rise to the occasion. This is a point Simone was making earlier. It's very, very hard because you're talking about what the world is going to be like in 20 years, and you're really interested in what's the world going to be like the day after the election. But I think we have got to the point where we're raising consciousness, and of course it's greatly helped by recent terrible climate events, right? Which we suffered in Canada too. I think of the fires in Western Canada, and I think we've got to the point where we are capable of overcoming this tremendous reluctance of democracies with their short-termism to address these problems. It's unfortunate that it took terrible events which wrecked people's lives and killed a lot of people, and it may take a few more of such events really to push us over the limit, but the finish line. But I think we can do it. But there's an immense difficulty to start with because of this sense of short-termism that people have in their lives. Yeah.
Professor Chambers, Scott on YouTube asks, is the only way to greater equality for Indigenous peoples to get involved in the current political system, or does our political system need to be transformed?
Sorry, the first part was...
Is the only way to greater equality for Indigenous peoples to get involved in the current system, or should the system, or does our political system need to be transformed?
Yes. Both. So we need to get involved in this system in order to transform the system. So, you know, we have equal voting rights in Canada, of course. In all democracies, we have equal voting rights, but these are formal voting rights. And so we really have to think of ways of including. So, you know, I always go back. So my thing is the public sphere. And so I really feel very strongly that votes are a certain type of power, but voice is an even more important source of power. So the question that I'm interested in is including more voices in our public debates, and those voices shouldn't be included just because of the numbers that stand behind them. They should be included because of the urgency of the claims that they are making. And so, you know, the Indigenous population of Canada, it doesn't speak in one voice. It actually has all sorts and there's differences of opinions within that community about moving forward and so on and so forth. So for me, it is getting more of those voices in the conversation, not just in the voting booth, to be able to have, to kind of raise the questions and the issues and so on that should be taken up by elites. And right now, you know, as I said, I think Canada, comparatively speaking, is not in such bad state, but I do think, as all democracies, there are exclusions in the public sphere, and I think Indigenous peoples is really the most sort of pressing question of inclusion in that debate.
I have a selfishly, I think I'm interested to hear the answer. Good question for both of you from Ehsan on YouTube. What are your thoughts on the polarization of mainstream media, predominantly in the U.S., where there is ignorance of certain stories from both sides in order to favor their respective ideology, be that left or right? And how do you think Canadian media compares? Is this purposeful ignorance dangerous, especially when talking about climate change or recession?
So the media landscape in the United States is really very complex, and I think that there is some evidence that there is asymmetry, which means that there still is a kind of mainstream legacy media that is, governed by the norms of journalism and truth, and actually it does. It's accessed by lots of people. And you really find these very tight-knit, say ecosystems and polarization in enclaves. And it's mostly really on the right and not on the left. So the disinformation is really asymmetrically distributed in the United States. It's very clear. There's no real, explanation for that. So I would disagree with this idea that the media is just in two camps and that they are equally, they're equally involved in misinformation or equally biased or equally. I think that there is, as I say, a Fox News Fox News just isn't facts. Fox News spends more time reporting about CNN being fake news than it actually reports about real news or even false news, right? So Fox News is really a scourge in the public sphere, and there isn't really an equivalent of Fox News with its kind of broad base on the center or on the left at all. So it is polarized, but it's asymmetrically polarized, and the pathology is really concentrated. I mean, there are millions of Americans who honestly believe that the election was stolen. There is not one shred of evidence, for this. And how could that be, right? I mean, this is just a complete fabrication. It's a delusion. And there just isn't anything equivalent on the other side. I mean, there's misinformation everywhere, but there's just nothing equivalent to that. And this asymmetry, I think, it's a problem, but it's not exactly a polarization problem.
Yeah, I think just quickly to interject, the difference is that CNN, for example, will have a concentration of voices on one side of the spectrum, or a selection of topics maybe that lend itself to one side of the spectrum that seems, quote unquote, to lean left, but it's not misinformation. It's not getting out there and lying about what's happening in the world and saying, don't get a vaccine or something to that effect.
But nor is it having people there who say, well, we want to have both sides. So here's a bunch of people who believe that the election was stolen. Yeah. But it's called both sidesism. So I don't think that is a good idea. So when CNN gets accused of being biased because it's not engaging in both sidism when it comes to questions like COVID and also election fraud, I don't see that as bias.
Yeah, no, I don't think that. I don't think. I mean, they've been accused of that for that reason, but I think that I do understand the criticism that, for example, there is a concentration of, there is one school of thought that is presented more often than not, but that's not misinformation. That's a totally different thing.
But that's not
Taylor?
the same as fake news. You see,
no, it's not. That's right. What I mean.
So the fake news is really much more concentrated on the right. But this is what really worries me, how bigger and bigger segments of the population can get captured by that. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that if you end up with your sense of what you're voting for on a crucial identity issue, the others are betraying America, and you can easily get yourself into a position where you can't accept the idea that your side isn't telling the truth, right? And so you just will not, and then you'll invent all sorts of conspiracy theories about why they're not and how they're inventing various facts and so on. And it's unfortunate truth about the United States that group of people that get captured in that set of in that echo chamber, if you like, are really growing. And even when the QAnon collapses because it predicts something that didn't happen, that same group goes on believing some of these things. Now, I think there ought to be here intervention of law. If the Fox News says something calumny about an individual, that individual can sue and get a lot of money from them. They can tell total lies, say no is a lie, and get away with it without any problem. So there ought to be some kind of recognized fact-finding bureau, just straight, unambiguous facts, like how much money was spent on this or that, and you ought to pay a heavy fine if you don't immediately correct and pay, for it. That there's got to be some effort to make news media become just minimally responsible.
How do you think the pandemic has affected, just as a follow-up, what both of you are talking about? And I say that even from personal experience, where I've never seen, people who I know, people who I've been friends with, now call me fake news, and that has really evolved and been exacerbated by, through the pandemic. I've never seen it to this level before. I know it was brewing through Trump and definitely spilled over here. And I'm not saying there's no culpability on the media side, but certainly the pandemic has exposed a whole new side of this. I'm just wondering from your perspective, how you think the pandemic has factored into all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that's the same thing. I mean, why do people develop this idea that wearing a mask is somehow, because there's a certain idea of our team and their team, right? And to be true to that team, which is tremendously important, they have to take up that stance. And if they don't, they're read out of that side, right? They're considered to be traitors. So it becomes a matter of ultimate, really crucial loyalty to believe that you shouldn't be forced to wear a mask, or that if you want to wear a mask, you're some kind of, like a real man, you're some kind of sissy. Becomes a loyalty. It's almost a set of loyalty oaths. Loyalty positions.
So there are a group of, so every democracy has anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers, right? But it's a question of numbers. So of course Canada has it too. And so in most places, it's sort of it's some kind of a combination of libertarianism and sometimes combined with alternative medicine, but it's only in the United States where it is connected to party politics. I mean, most places, in Canada they had to find a party, right, to kind of glob onto. So in the United States, it's bizarre that this public health issue has kind of folded into a political polarization issue, and political scientists really have never seen this kind of thing. But there actually is signs. So, vaccination numbers are kind of creeping up in the United States, and there is a sign of, I think, of weakness in this kind of polarized, very small, but there was supposed to be on Saturday a rally in defense of the January 6th storming of and it was very poorly attended. Maybe it was because there were so many police that nobody came, but yeah. So this connection between pandemic and politics is really only seen in the United States. Although every liberal democracy has some form of minority who are pushing back against pandemic regulation. Even in Germany, it's there.
I have time for a few more questions, so I'll switch gears a little bit here because someone has a question for you that's based on things that you've talked about tonight. Claire asks, on the topic of citizen assemblies, a Belgian town has been the first to abolish a long-term or permanent citizens' council. Do you think that Canada looked beyond the occasional citizen assemblies to establish a more permanent one?
So I would love to see the Senate become a citizen assembly. So they are actually best at one-off problem solving, right? So they are best at being given, the question of, okay, climate change, come up with policies that will both address. So one of the reasons why in France they set up the Citizen Assembly on climate change, it was in the aftermath of the Gilets jaunes. So you had these people who were workers who were pushing back against gasoline tax because the gasoline tax was actually going to affect, truck drivers and people who were farmers and people who really needed to use gas for work. So it was a working class, kind of left radical movement. And so one of the things that Macron decided to do is he said, look, okay, but how are we going to deal with climate change if we don't actually have taxes on gas? And he says, why don't you figure it out? So he got, and it was really kind of brilliant because he got these ordinary citizens together, and they really, once they started talking about it, they said, well, I guess we actually do have to have taxes on gas because, and so they came forward with these really progressive policies, which then in the end Macron didn't push for because he gets into Parliament, and then there are businesses and other kinds of pressures. So they're best at one-off. So not permanent, that is set up sometimes, or they can be set up permanently in conjunction with if you have a system where you have regular initiatives. But Canada doesn't have that. Canada's referendums are all special referendums, so their citizens' assemblies would all be one-off citizen assemblies, either connected with a referendum or a problem. But I would love to see a more permanent institution which is connected not just to consultation but to legislation, to be a balance. I don't know how strong the Triple E's would be in this Senate, but that is a very long-term kind of aspiration. But that is my aspiration for Canada.
What does the perfect Senate look like to you?
Sorry?
What does the perfect Senate look like to you?
Well, it would be a citizen assembly, so it would be a randomly selected group of citizens who would come together and who would oversee and comment on legislation. The question about is, how the Triple E's, how effective it would be, or how much it could it actually veto legislation, or could it just recommend legislation? But it would definitely be a sounding board and a kind of citizen accountability for Parliament. I think it would be a wonderful institution.
Would you have a rotation of members, or would it be the same members for?
No. You'd have a rotation in members. So you'd have. So one of the questions is accountability, because people don't get, of course, you can't vote the bums out of office. But there is a certain type of, they have to justify their, publicly and answer questions in that kind of sense. But you could have terms, 3 years or 2 years. And it would be like, the selection process is like the jury selection. The structure of the deliberation is not like jury deliberation, but so any Canadian could be called up to sit in the Senate. It would be, actually, we will see more and more citizen assemblies. You're seeing them all over liberal democracies, and there will be, you'll get a thing in the mail saying, come to Ottawa.
A different kind of sober second thought. I have 1 minute left for one final question, Dr. Taylor, so I'll throw it your way. This is a fun one to end on. What role should the Crown or Governor General have in agreeing or rejecting early unnecessary elections? Something tells me this was spurred on by the last election.
No, I think that the present rules are, we can't get around them, that the Governor General, like the Queen, has to follow the advice of the... Now, there are these cases, remember, when Harper prorogued Parliament, and it was very dubious. There are cases which are very close to the cliff where you might want to say, and perhaps we should rewrite the rules a little bit to deal with those cases. But in general, it's got to be taking the advice of the Prime Minister.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you both very much. Really enjoyed your insights this evening, as I'm sure our audience did as well. Thank you.
So we're a tag team. I'd like to welcome the Honourable Anne McClellan, who's the other co-chair of the Advisory Council, and who has the distinction of winning 4 elections as a Liberal in Alberta. Yes. So that I think is a mark of distinction. I want to thank on all of our behalves the speakers tonight and the moderator. I want to thank both Simone Chambers and Charles Taylor for giving us an incredibly wide array of topics to focus on. I think they've set an agenda for the next several years in terms of the future of the Stanfield conversations. I must say that I'm much less depressed than I expected to be. I don't think democracy is nearly as threatened as I might have expected before the conversation. And so I want to thank you both for being here. I want to particularly comment on the fact that I never expected to be in a major public lecture where the esteemed Professor Taylor would be referred to as Chuck. So I think that bringing that level of informality is actually something that we aspire to in this series. I'd like to turn it over to Anne McClellan to talk a little bit about the future of the series and about her own thanks.
Actually, my remarks are going to be very short, but I want to add my thanks to Professors Chambers and Taylor for being here with us this evening, and Vashi, to you for moderating the conversation. A couple of thank yous that haven't already taken place. First of all, let me say that I am deeply honored to work with the Right Honourable Joe Clark in the capacity as co-chair for the Stanfield Conversations. It has been for me a wonderful number of months as Joe and I and the Advisory Council have worked together along with David and the Political Science Department, the President and his office, to develop and imagine what the Stanfield Conversations could be. So, Joe, always a pleasure to work with you. And I also want to say a big thank you to someone else this evening, and all of you in the audience, and I presume most of you are from Halifax or the region, someone who will be well known to you and without whom there would be no Stanfield Conversations, and that is George Cooper. And George, yes, George deserves a big round of applause. George, who was a dear friend of Robert L. Stanfield, discovered that actually there was a shocking omission here at Dalhousie University, and I am the former chancellor of Dalhousie University. Maybe I should have identified this for myself, George. But he identified that actually there was no lecture series in honor of one of this province's outstanding premiers and one of our nation's great politicians as leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. And George decided to do something about it. And we all owe George a great debt of thanks, because George decided that George would actually raise the money that now endows the Stanfield Lectures in perpetuity. And George, I think all of us this evening would agree that, one, Robert L. Stanfield should absolutely be honored and recognized by his alma mater, Dalhousie University, and that, in fact, nothing could be more fitting in keeping with his values than talking about democracy. So, George, on behalf of all of us from not only the Dalhousie community, but well beyond, thank you for this inspired idea. I also want to thank other members of the Advisory Council who are here tonight. I had the opportunity to chat with some before the evening began. This is a hard-working Advisory Council, and I sincerely, and I know on behalf of Joe as well, want to thank everybody on the Advisory Council. They, in fact, began the discussion around what should the Stanfield Conversations be about, and came to the conclusion, considering what's going on in the world today, that democracy seemed to be an appropriate and timely subject matter for the conversation. And with that, I will end, other than to say, Professor Taylor, you said something that I will think a great deal about in the coming days, weeks, and months as we plan the next Stanfield Conversation on democracy. And I should remind people that this is not a one-off. We actually expect these conversations to take place every year and in perpetuity. But Professor Taylor, you said the following: democracy has to rise to the occasion. I think if one deconstructs that, David, former chair of the Political Science Department, we could in fact have many stimulating, challenging conversations over many years to come. So thank you, Professor Taylor, for that thought, because I know at least I will go home tonight and think a lot about democracy rising to the occasion. So thank you all for being here this evening, our first Stanfield conversation on democracy, and I reassure you there will be many more, and we hope to see next year, David, many more people in this hall.
We're looking forward to that. I want to say that, like Anne, it strikes me that you have laid out an agenda for the next decade of Stanfield Conversations, so thank you for that. I also wanted to acknowledge with thanks the partnership with CBC in the spirit of speaking about a vibrant press and the role that they play. I also want to acknowledge the questions that we heard from the audience, which I think, to my mind, validates something that I know Professor Chambers writes quite a bit about, as does Professor Taylor, which is the importance of a vital public sphere. And clearly the fact that so many of you were listening and so many of you were contributing these very thoughtful questions is a sign that there's a good deal of vitality and health to our democratic political life. So thank you all for coming. We'll look forward to seeing you again sooner than... Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you.